as we always kick off all of our lives, we're about to hit our 1-year anniversary of these, I believe.
We are.
We are. We started them in March last year at the beginning of lockdown, but really the mission of these is the same as our business mission right when we founded FashMash back 9 years ago. It is to encourage open conversation and sharing of ideas to shape the future of fashion.
And on that very note, shaping the future of fashion, as I said, so buzzing for this conversation. It feels like this is such an important one. It's all about inspiring positive change, as you can see from our title here. And this follows all sorts of conversations we've been having over the past year. We've talked a lot about sustainable storytelling. We've talked about centering social justice, scaling circularity, all sorts of different things related to today's topic. You can find them all on our IGTV or indeed via our YouTube. But this evening, Inspiring Positive Change, we really want to talk about how we change sustainable messaging from being about doom and gloom to truly driving progress through a much more positive and contributive lens. And this comes from a place of seeing a lot of greenwashing, goes without saying, but a lot of focus also on sustainability really being about sacrifice. And us wanting to push for this desire there is out there for a completely new narrative for all of this. So lots and lots to dig into. But Rosanna, a few notices from you before we do.
Yeah, the first one, which is so exciting, we talk about dialogue and conversation. Well, obviously, we therefore had to embrace an Instagram room. So tonight we're going to be having our first Instagram room. And Rachel and I, obviously, we still had to have our one-on-one co-founder time. So we're going to have about 25, 30 minutes of discussion between us first. And then 2 of our members will be joining us to expand on the topic later on. I also wanted to say a big thank you to our sponsor, Klaviyo. They are on board for another year. They're a brilliant e-commerce marketing platform for brands of all types and sizes, from Skinny Dip London to High Tights, High Studio. We have recently transferred all of our email marketing over to them, and both the insights that we get from them, the targeted precision marketing that we're able to use, and of course the customer service make it all really easy for us. We highly recommend them. Go to klaviyo.com/fashmash for a free trial, and that's Klaviyo spelled KLAVIYO.com/fashmash.
We're obviously doing what caught our eye this month. I'm going to go first and throw one out into the ether. I'm going first because it is so directly linked to our conversation that I don't want it to just segue straight into that, and I want to give your one some space in the middle. So mine is a website called Stories for Life. I was sent this through a friend, and I spent hours on this website this weekend, lockdown life. And this directly links to our conversation tonight. And that is because it's a project that is dedicated to explaining how our existing dominant narratives are so drastically wrong, and that ultimately they are what sits at the heart of the climate crisis that we're facing. So there are 2 that it explains. They're quite straightforward. The first is that we treat nature as our slave. Really interesting. And the second is that we see productivity alone as success. So that basically means that we exploit nature, we quite literally ravage it for the sake of growing our economy. And indeed, that in turn, that's because we think that making more money is more important than anything else, including indeed our own well-being and ultimately our lives in general as a human race, because we are once again quite literally ravaging them by way of destroying our planet. So it's a beautiful site. It's so nicely done because it really contextualizes what the issue is with those 2 different narratives, how they come together, but also starts to look at the way that we're actually seeing that storytelling play out. Like we're all participating in that storytelling, we're all putting that out into the world. And then it talks about how we can move from those horror stories to what it calls love stories instead, and talks about the power of narrative basically. So really worth spending a couple of hours on, or indeed just head over there and have a quick look. I literally can't shout about it enough. I just adored it, and I thought it was so relevant to a lot of the work that I'm doing, a lot of the work that I think needs to happen in this space, and of course our conversation tonight. So
I love that. You
it's great.
Discover such good things. Mine are always so generic.
No, they're not at all. They're not whatsoever. And I love it. I already know what yours is for tonight, and I love it. So over to you.
it just, I had to share this one because as I'm sure many of you know, I've been a long time Chloe lover, but also a long time lover of Gabriella Hearst. And again, I feel this relates to this evening's conversation in a really impactful way. I'm actually going to reference her collection a lot throughout tonight. So Gabriella had her debut collection for Chloe showcased at Paris Fashion Week. She chose to film it outside, obviously, the empty lockdown streets of Brasserie Lip. And it was just fantastic in that sustainability wasn't a gimmick for the collection. It was just a given. It was just woven completely throughout it. And I noticed that a lot of the catwalk reports, if they tried to list out almost all of the sustainable initiatives within the collection, they kind of put their hands up and said, I can't even start here because there was a plethora of it was just every single aspect of it. I suppose one of my favorites that I have to mention straight away is the Edith bags that the studio had sourced from eBay. And then they reimagined them using offcuts from the studio floor, which I just found ingenious. And also, I love the kind of fateful aspect of it in that Gabriella's first luxury bag that she ever bought was an Edith bag. So it had all come full circle. It's also circular fashion, just lots of wonderful circles. And then a statistic just to share with you to really convey the impact of Gabriella already at Chloe. And it's also worth mentioning her brilliant new CEO who is equally passionate about sustainability. So this collection's environmental footprint is down 400% on last season. And we're going to discuss statistics a lot this evening and how sometimes they're often used and abused, but I think that statistic really speaks for itself. I encourage you all to obviously view the collection, watch the film, have a read about it as well. I think Gabriella is one of those creative directors who interviews really beautifully. An interview that came out 6 days ago on Vogue US. It's called one of the Good Morning Vogue series. And she talks a lot about her journey to becoming the new creative director. Obviously, the founder of Chloe was called Gabby as well. So oh my gosh, it's another full circle. But yeah, it is. I feel very, very strongly that this really is going to mark a step change in the luxury industry, and it is so exciting to see. Go have a look. And onwards now to our conversation. Rachel.
Yeah, indeed. So where we started from was just this idea that, and we wrote this in our Instagram caption, doom and gloom, a sense of shame and guilt, even feelings of hopelessness and despair are all really genuine, very real associations when we start thinking and talking about the climate crisis. We know that we need to inspire change because of that. We know we need to do everything we can to make people recognise how important it is that we start to shift towards progress. But the problem is that a lot of the messaging that surrounds it as a result makes action feel so huge and so complicated and thus so dire that success seems almost impossible. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges we're facing now, is to actually think, we talk all the time about it being systemic. How do we go from something that's systemic into something that's actually like manageable and bite-sized and thus achievable? And I've got a great quote that comes from the climatologist, one of the sort of very early climate scientists. His name's Michael E. Mann. And he wrote, this is in an interview for The Guardian that just came out recently. He says, doom mongering has overtaken denial as a threat and as a tactic. Inactivists are what he's now calling climate deniers. You can't deny it anymore, but you can be inactive about it. He says, inactivists know that if people believe there is nothing you can do, they are led down a path of disengagement. They unwittingly do the bidding of fossil fuel interests by giving up. What is so pernicious about this is that it seeks to weaponize environmental progressives who would otherwise be on the front line demanding change. These are folks of good intentions and good will, but they become disillusioned or depressed and they fall into despair. And I think what's really interesting about that is that fashion really falls within that narrative so easily. We talk all the time about the fact that we've got to change our shopping behaviour. We've all got to change. We've got to stop buying as much stuff. We've got to change the way that we do it, etc., etc. And the trouble with that sort of articulating it around that behavioural change, of course, that it really closely links to sacrifice. It makes it sound as if it's on us. We have to give something up. It's our responsibility to change, and not obviously this bigger broken system. And you know, the other challenge of that is that it gets into very political conversations about sustainable fashion actually being negative for people that can't afford it. You know, it's anti-democratic to say that you can only buy sustainable, etc. Because, you know, there are certain people that quote unquote can only afford fast fashion. And I say quote unquote there because it's a very, very deep argument that we're probably not going to have time to go into tonight. But indeed, you know, it's suggesting that that it is only those that can not afford to buy more expensive fashion that buy fast fashion. And of course, we know that's certainly not the case. And I think the bigger issue here, and one of the things that we talked about quite a lot in our roundtable discussion on this very subject with our community last week, is that idea of cognitive dissonance. You know, so that piece that I mentioned already about feeling hopeless, like genuinely playing out in our everyday lives, but without necessarily us recognizing it. So it's the simple idea that we reason away from believing that our individual actions will be significant, or that the outcomes of them in this case will impact climate change in any way. And by thinking that, it basically means that we can go ahead and buy the outfit anyway, right? One little action is not going to make that much difference. And also that actually the outcomes of climate change aren't going to affect me. They're going to be in other nations. They're not going to be here at home. And of course, we know that from recent news, if not before, obviously, that is certainly not the case. And we're seeing the climate crisis playing out here on home shores as well. And I think also the other side of that, when we're thinking about sort of cognitive dissonance, is also this idea of behavioural change, full stop, and behavioural science. And what that shows us, you know, again, no time to go into the detail of it, but what it shows us is that negative stories traditionally don't lead to change. You know, if we think about the idea of shaming and blaming people, it doesn't make us go, you know what, you're right, I'm going to change everything. Now, it does for a small minority, of course, but what we're talking about here is needing the whole world to change, which obviously it's not going to achieve. Now, the difficulty, I think, with all of this, when we sort of start to break it down, it is such a complicated thing to break down. Like, how do you move away from doom and gloom? How do you make it something really positive? When it actually is doom and gloom. It is a really serious topic, right? Obviously, it is incredibly negative. Like, we have to remember the reason that we started talking about the climate emergency, that word emergency, is to try and make people realize like how urgent it is. You know, Greta Thunberg talks to this idea of like our house being on fire, our house obviously literally being the planet, and if our house was on fire, we would all try and get out as quickly as possible. So you know, what is our sort of version of that? And this idea that, you know, we really only have a very short amount of time to make any significant change. We're talking about 9 years now. So it's really around how we get the industry to take that seriously, and how we sort of, I guess, use that doom and gloom in some ways to make the case for how crucial it is, whilst obviously also thinking about how we, I guess, adjust that in a way that leads to behavioural change as well, which is a really nuanced and very complex area to sort of explore. And what we wanted to do tonight was think about that a little bit, and think about how that plays out, and think about what that could look like, to think about a more inspiring and positive narrative. So yeah, so much to explore with all of this. And one of the things I keep saying, and I'm going to say it here as well, because I think it's so important to contextualize, is that I think fashion is the perfect case study for what needs to change in the world, full stop. If you think about everything that's wrong with fashion, you know, two main words, there are many, but two main words being extractive and exploitative. If we take those two things and change them, obviously we'll be looking at a very, very different planet. And obviously we had the amazing Baroness Lola Young talking about tackling modern slavery on our Pioneers event last month. And she talked wonderfully about how the environmental crisis is obviously so inherently linked to systemic inequality and to racism, and sort of brought all of that full circle, you know, basically saying that we need to address all of this. All of these things go hand in hand. You know, exploitation of people and planet is purely for profit, and addressing that is what's going to obviously lead to any level of systemic change. But as we said, we need to do so in a way that inspires change, really truly inspires action. And I think that's really, really exciting. It makes us think about, how do we change narratives? How do we change the paradigm that we're in? You know, or rather, we change the narrative, the paradigm that we're in, by changing the narrative. And I think that's the point that we're sort of focusing on a little bit. You know, both of us really have spent our careers as storytellers. And I think that's a really exciting thing to think about. It's like, how do we change the stories of how we see the world? You know, stories really are the foundation of our world. They're the foundation of society. We know that COVID has started to do this. COVID has started to change our narrative of how we interact, full stop, and indeed what we expect from the world. Albeit in, you know, some very, very devastating ways, it has been a really positive disruptive force in other ways. It's certainly a big disruptive force. And it's made us think in this sector about what overproduction and overconsumption looks like. And I think that's a huge positive. And, you know, there's all sorts of statistics flying around the way that consumers, you know, if we call them consumers for the moment, are thinking about the impact of COVID and their relationship as a result with consumption. And that's hugely positive. You know, we are starting to see that people are not only buying less because they've been in lockdown, but starting to think about the fact that they want to buy less, full stop, moving forward, and that indeed limiting climate change is more important to them now than it was before the pandemic began, which is huge. I think one caveat to throw in here, and then Rosanna, I'd love to throw it over to you because I know you've got some really positive, strong thoughts around this. But one caveat to throw in is that in this context of talking about positivity and everything that needs to change, I think one of the challenges is that we come up with there's a bit of a barrier, or rather a bit of a blind spot around if we kind of go out there with this sort of overt optimism around the sort of, you know, what's coming down the line. Obviously, we see a lot of greenwashing. We've seen tons of that within fashion and within sustainable fashion specifically. It's a really, really grey area when we talk about this idea of selling sustainability, which essentially is what we're trying to do. And of course, there have been so many call-outs. I know you track this really closely, don't you? The way that greenwashing.
Yeah, I track it closely also because increasingly, I have a lot of conversations often with Livia Firth of EcoAge, and she has her finger on the pulse of greenwashing. But yeah, some ones to throw out that I'm sure so many of us are aware of are things like ASOS had a circular collection last year, which actually, or in fact, their marketing was almost, we are going circular. There was a definite circular push for the brand, and it only comprised 0.35% of their 85,000 product offering. Then we have obviously the infamous misguided recycled collection, and that was merchandised next to a £1 bikini. And then also there are examples in the luxury market as well. And let's not forget, I think the easiest way to track greenwashing and the most important way to track it, particularly in light of what we're mentioning about our conversation with Baroness Lola Young, Remake Our World, go on the website, you can very clearly see the brands that have not paid up. And the brands, most of those brands in that list have very clear eco-green policies that they're trying to convey to the press. And that is really concerning. And I think so often the brands that greenwash focus on the environmental messaging because it's very tangible. You can pick out a few facts and figures, and then they hope to shroud the social injustice going on in the background. On a more positive note, I just did want to, I have a great quote from Gabriella. This is unplanned, but I have just remembered it and found it. I wanted to say it's about change in the fashion system thanks to COVID. Thanks to COVID is a funny thing to say, but due to COVID. And she said, post-pandemic, the sort of hedonistic luxury that was already feeling old before is totally dead now. I think and hope that people will opt more for craft and quality post-pandemic. And I really like that quote.
Yeah, I really like that too. And I think the points you've made about greenwashing are really relevant as well. And that piece between environmental and social and where they come together. And actually, it should almost be that if you don't have the social piece sorted out first, you shouldn't really be able to talk about the environmental. Because as you say, it's almost easy to just, mask it with some, we're all moving to sustainable materials by 2025, well done us, which obviously we know means nothing. I think again, you know, certainly through COVID, but even before that, the consumer is becoming way more cynical about this. You know, we are seeing people asking more questions, which is obviously hugely important, but also asking people to basically, I guess, be more accountable, you know, challenging them, asking them to sort of be more transparent and share what's going on. So I think we will see more and more of that. And also we're going to see more legislation. Certainly in the UK, that's coming down the line. I had an amazing conversation last week with the founder of Compare Ethics, a woman called Abby, and she's fantastic. And she was giving me so many insights around the legal side of all of this and the legislation that's going to come through from the Consumer Markets Authority, and particularly, yeah, looking at what greenwashing means, the idea that we're going to have to substantiate our claims, importantly, but also the piece I thought was really interesting is that we're going to have to share and be transparent about what we're not saying. So that example you gave there about ASOS. Obviously H&M being another one as well, you know, making it very clear that actually this is only X% of the collection and everything else, by the way, is not so good. I think that's really interesting. So we'll see how that develops. Abby was very clear that it's going to be quite substantial over the course of the rest of this year. So let's see where it gets to. The UK is really leading the way on it, apparently. So that's really positive. What's your perspective, though, you know, in this wider context of thinking about narrative change? How do you think we do reimagine the narrative of this sector? That being a huge question.
In, you know, 5 minutes or less. So selling sustainability, it's an oxymoron, as we already said, but we have to get our heads around how to do that. Because of fashion being the industry that it is, there has to be desirability there. That is at the core of the very industry. And it's always on my mind, that oxymoron. And that's why I was so, because also the reason, let's not forget the reason I picked Gabriella Hearst's collection is I watched that collection, I watched that film, and I had that frisson of desire that a really good collection, you can get that just from looking at the images.
Yeah, that's so true.
And we shouldn't feel bad when we feel that. It shouldn't be this guilt idea that we have. It frustrates me that Vogue's review of said collection mentioned how the designs would resonate with the luxury neo-hippie eco-warrior consumer. Yeah. Now, doubtless it will resonate with them, of course. It's got admirable credentials, why wouldn't it? But for far too long, words like hippie, words like eco-warrior have been associated with the sustainability movement, and they have led it to feeling undesirable and unattainable. And I think unattainable is really important there as well. You think, I'm not an eco-warrior. I try and do my bit, but I can't possibly compare. And so you don't want to get involved.
It's not sexy. It doesn't make it sound glamorous at all.
You know, how can we reimagine this? How can we reimagine this narrative? There's an element also that I think is worth mentioning, that a lot of bigger brands are in denial and they kind of push it away from them. So they say, well, small startups, D2C, of course they can achieve this. They're starting from the ground up. But actually, I think what's really exciting is if we can see a Titanic level ship a la Chloe manage to pivot, then there is no longer that excuse. And in terms of desirability, the consumer often looks to high fashion, to fashion week as their starting point for inspiration, and then it trickles down. So I think that's promising if change can come from the top of the fashion ecosystem. I think let's look at the media, both traditional and digital. On the former, I was interviewed recently by ex-Grazia editor and now brilliant sustainability champion Melanie Rickey. And she mentioned on that live how an editor had said to her recently, oh, we've got our sustainability issue coming up. And her retort was, that's not good enough. It should be woven into every page of that publication. One issue is just not enough. And I think that's very much like Hearst's collection, the new Chloe collection. It's woven in, it's integral to it. I also think there's perhaps a certain amount of education required here. You know, sustainability is a hugely complex area, and to be able, like any field that's very complex, you can only convey it with coherency and with understandability and a kind of a compelling narrative if you've got that know-how really clear in your own mind. Rachel, what are your thoughts here? When it comes to media, is it an education issue? I personally feel like articles often in the sustainability space are just throwing statistics at me. And is that because the press releases are given to the art journalists in that way?
I think you're right in some ways. And I've had quite a lot of conversations around how this is like another form of greenwashing from the brands. It's like, sort of information overload, just give you so much that you've got to kind of wade through it. I think that's why we see so much misinformation that's put out there, because actually it's almost kind of trying to hide behind statistics in some ways, and people are very good at doing it with percentages and not actually giving absolute numbers behind things. So we see X amount of percentage decrease in reduction in impact, but they don't do that in context to how much growth has happened in the business alongside, and things like that, and many, many more. There's a very good article in the Financial Times arguing whether sustainable fashion could ever actually be a reality. And then there's another really good resource on this, the New Standard Institute. They basically say there is a huge onus on the fashion media. It says to, and quote, responsibly cover the vague world of sustainable, ethical, mindful, conscious, green, eco-conscious, eco-friendly fashion, which I just love. I love that sort of spiel of all of these words that we use. And ensure accuracy. It's on a journey. It's like what you get absolutely drummed into you. As you know, I'm trained as a journalist, drummed into you that accuracy is the number one thing. Now, obviously, the whole misinformation, fake news thing is a sort of part of the world that we live in these days, and poor journalism is there as well. But there's also a lot of good journalism, and I think it's absolutely the responsibility of the journalist to ensure this is right, and it's on the brands obviously to ensure that they're not doing misinformation intentionally by hiding behind statistics. Now, that's always been sort of the way that PR operates in many ways, but this is too serious a topic for it to actually happen. The New Standard Institute is doing so much work on this. So if anybody is interested, they've got a resource that they're working on that's really about providing clarity on those stats. So it's really, really worth looking at. And then the other thing I wanted to say is I think this has to go beyond fashion media, as well. It's not just about within fashion, the fashion journalists talking about this change. It has to be on the business pages, on the finance pages, all of that sort of side of things. I had a really interesting conversation with Lucy Siegel, the Guardian journalist, about this. She's really big on it. This is what inspired her to launch her podcast called So Hot Right Now, which is about communicating sustainable change. And we've talked about it so many times in our lives. It's so good. But that came from a report that was written by the Columbia Journalism Review, and the report was called "The Media Are Complacent While the World Burns," and it basically says that climate change. The whole report looks at how little climate change is reported within the mass media. But there's one part particularly that stood out for me, which said climate change touches virtually every beat in the newsroom, meaning that nearly every journalist has something to contribute to its coverage. And I just thought that was really strong. Saying that it's not just if you are the sustainability journalist within a newspaper, same as it's not just if you're the fashion journalist and sustainable fashion is now the trendy thing to report on. It should be across absolutely everything. As you said before, your conversation with Melanie, it shouldn't be the one issue of the magazine. It should be in every single issue. So yeah, I love that. And then I think the other side to that is if we're talking about the journalists and the media, we have to talk about the advertisers that of course appear in that space and pay for it in the first place. I think there's so much responsibility there. And for me, changing the narrative really comes down to those brands. They are the sort of the starting point for what our messaging is in the first place. They have the straight line to the customer, more really than anywhere else in terms of influence these days. And of course they are the really, really seductive marketing machine. That's what it's sort of built for. That's what we've seen across this whole industry since the beginning of time. Is really, even within sustainable fashion, it is still about peddling consumerism. And I think if we're going to change the narrative there, we have to address what and how we're communicating. And I get quite excited about this space because I think there's some really interesting work coming down the pipeline or already started that's really helping. There's a company called Purpose Disruptors, which I'm sure, again, I've already talked about on our lives. And they are really tackling this from the angle of the advertising sector specifically, so working with the agencies and the media buyers and so forth, and looking at how their tagline is that they only want to promote attitudes, lifestyles and behaviours that are consummate with a 1.5 degree world. So basically ensure that communications actively paint a picture of what it would look like to live within the Paris Agreement goals towards that target of 2030, rather than detract from them, which obviously advertising at the moment is doing by just telling us to buy all the time. It's not saying, okay, but think about the context of what a sustainable lifestyle looks like. And I really think that's key, because we have to be able to visualize it. Us as citizens, us as people that work in the industry, we have to be able to see a vision of what that future looks like. And that's why that thing I mentioned at the beginning, the Stories for Life website, is, I think, so exciting. Sorry, Story for Life's website. Because of course that's around how we exploit nature and of course people in our supply chain for the sake of productivity, or indeed let's call it greed ultimately. And it's, you know, it helps us to sort of think about how do we change that narrative, as I mentioned, from horror to love, or how do we think about, you know, amazing words that fashion is inherently connected with, but we don't think about very much in terms of the sustainable messaging. So things like, you know, joy and justice and abundance and nature and positivity and renewal and resilience, and, you know, there's so many amazing words, regeneration, so many amazing words in there that we could start to think about instead. And I think that gets really exciting. And I love this idea of like the oxygen of publicity, and thinking about feeding that kind of oxygen instead. For me is yeah, it has just so much potential. And I think that's what's really, as you can probably tell, is really like firing me up right now for the sort of change that I think we need. And I also think it then makes us think about, you know, what within all of that, if fashion is so seductive, within all of that, we need to think about what is aspiration and what is desire, right? We can't just think about what's worthy, because we know that what's worthy doesn't lead to enough behaviour change. So we have to make it, as we mentioned before, it has to be sexy. It has to be things that people really want. I mean, obviously influence is a huge part of this, right? And I know, again, that's something you track massively.
Yeah.
Do you think it can happen at scale within fashion, that we can move the dial on the way that influence really plays a part in what is desirable in the first place?
And I love what you said about advertisers, by the way, because that was actually kind of what I was trying to touch on in my first point when I mentioned everybody looks to high fashion as the starting point.
Yeah.
Actually, it's these big advertising. So it'll be really interesting to see where that takes us next.
Yeah, you're so right.
Yeah, and I think that will have a massive impact. And I'm pleased that you brought out the point on advertisers. It's where it all begins. Yeah, influencers. I feel like there are just, and I'm going to try and summarize my thoughts here, because it's a big topic. There's basically two ends of the spectrum. And at one end, you've got eco warriors, for whom, you know, their passion is so strong for this space that actually it basically rules them out from any paid partnerships with any businesses with traditional linear business models. You know, they wouldn't go near the business wouldn't go near them. It just would never work. Then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got traditional fashion influencers, and they're perhaps struggling to, even if they're starting to have an interest in sustainability, they're a bit afraid to express it because of call out culture, cancel culture. So it's this very fine balance running between the two of them at the moment. And, you know, it's an exhausting minefield. That said, even for the consumer, it's exhausting too, because, you know, what are they meant to think if one of their favorite influencers one day in stories expresses a burgeoning interest in renting and says that they're going to start renting more and give some examples, and then the following day does a paid partnership in the feed with a fast fashion brand? What do you meant to think of that? How does that have integrity? But, you know, equally, we all know that for Gen Z, influencers have huge impact. That is where the sales happen. So this has to change. It's chicken and egg. What's going to come first? What's going to start that change? Influencers prepared to change their narrative. Will that come first? Or is it actually that the big brands are prepared to educate and inform their influencer portfolio just as much as their consumer? Are the big brands going to push the change? And that's all against a background of cancel culture, where really, until the call out culture intrinsic to social media right now calms down, just a little bit, until then, new voices will be afraid to join, because without that perfectionism that seems unattainable to them, they'll be scared off. It's also a question of credibility. At present, many brands don't actually feel that traditional influencers, for the reasons I mentioned above, and perhaps for past paid partnerships, they don't feel that they are the correct voices to be having influence in the space of sustainability. So they often turn to tastemakers instead. And perhaps, therefore, it's a case of develop or die for these influencers, because if brands are going to start turning away from them because they think they lack credibility, so much of this goes beyond marketing. We need to talk about the product. I think that we, on our roundtable, many of us concurred that a great example here is Tesla. It is a brand that unites the environmental credentials with aesthetic desirability. And there needs to be this product that is driven first by desire. I'm delighted to say that we have one such product-led business founder joining us shortly for our Instagram live room, Edzard of Sheep Included, and I'm sure that he can elaborate for us. Rachel, before we do, you have a brilliant reference that you shared with me earlier today, the architecture of desire. Could you tell me more about that? Because I wasn't actually familiar with it.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's just really connecting the dots between comms and products. So it's that piece that I said before that, you know, our industry, we are architects of desire. That's what we do as brands, right? We sort of shape desire and make it obviously appealing to people. So I think it's about that on the one hand. It's about creating the desire, creating this sort of seduction. And then I think it's also about making it available. That's the other side. There's literally no point in social proofing, you know, or giving sustainability and sustainability messaging some sort of social currency with it, whichever one of those influences that you've mentioned, if we can't actually then give people the action point to make it, you know, make it accessible to them as well. And I think that's the product piece here as well. You know, it's all well and good. That's a bit the greenwashing piece as well. If we're just sort of saying, you know, this is everything that needs to change, but here's our sort of, you know, might be sustainable material by 2025 solution. It's not really enough. You know, it has to go that point further. Now, we are seeing a huge number of solutions, of course, being developed constantly, which is incredibly exciting. It's huge, but we need scale. Number one, we need like massive scale, and that obviously is going to take all sorts in the way of investment and funding. You know, so we need that to be backed from an R&D perspective, and we need that to be backed obviously from a sort of frontline funding point of view as well. We need more geographies. I think that's the other thing. We live in this little echo chamber of London, and of course a lot of our counterparts that we talk to around the world are also in major cities, but that doesn't make it accessible. You know, even the charity shops that are in you know, some of the sort of country parts of the UK are not particularly appealing charity shops like we get here, whereas H&M is a really, really appealing shop that's sort of next door or just round the corner kind of thing. So they can't really compete. So we need to make a sort of more sustainable version of consumption accessible all around the world, and particularly obviously outside of major cities, and obviously the same with the way that we digitize that as well. So I think a really big part when we're talking about changing the narrative is to push for more entrepreneurship massively, and more investment, of course, as well, to make that viable. And I think the other side, you know, and this goes back, I guess, to the behavioural science piece as well, is that a lot of what we talked about today, besides anything, because we don't have time really to expand it further, but a lot of what we talked about is obviously around the consumer, and obviously it cannot be on the consumer alone to drive this change. We know that, and I wanted to, I guess, sort of caveat our conversation with that before people start saying that we've missed the point of the change that needs to happen. We know that, you know, consumers alone are not going to cut it, basically. And I think when we're talking here right now, then sustainable consumption, from where we're coming from, is a sort of movement for systemic change. That's the way I think about it. It can be the catalyst, you know, if we really have this drive behind it, to then place the emphasis on businesses and governments to actually enable it. And I think the point here is that we know everyone has a part to play in this, and we know everyone has a part to play, particularly within the storytelling and within the narrative side of things too, not just marketers. You know, it comes down to everyone. So we as citizens, for instance, can play a huge part in ensuring that the narrative we're hitting policymakers with is one of change as well. And that's particularly obviously pertinent at the moment when we're thinking about, you know, the idea of peaceful protesting and everything being really under the microscope currently in the UK, and what does that look like with its relationship with the climate crisis too. I think that's really crucial.
I just want to give a brief introduction to both of them. So they joined our roundtable last week. All of our discussions begin with a small roundtable of members where we can brainstorm ideas and have a kind of very honest and open conversation about challenges and hurdles. Edzard, could you introduce yourself first?
Yeah, so I'm the co-founder of a brand called Sheep Inc., which is a sustainable knitwear brand. But I suppose our real focus has been on how you bring change to the supply chain in fashion, and how can you provide items, in our case, that actually have a carbon negative impact on the environment. So we spend a long time focusing on the raw material stage of our supply chain. And we work with regenerative farms in New Zealand that basically have a carbon negative impact through adopting regenerative farming methods. And then through the rest of our supply chain, we have a very, very strong focus on working with as sustainable suppliers as possible. So we manufacture carbon neutrally, and we make sure that we also use methods like zero waste manufacturing through whole garment 3D knitting machines. And sorry, and one final piece, I suppose, also is like we also have a model where we invest 5% of our revenue into biodiversity projects, which is also a bit of a feed into what can brands do in this space. It's like we really also want to show the market that, listen, if a small brand like us can kind of adopt that model, there's no reason that some of the big brands also can't start to, I suppose, siphon off a bit more profit towards biodiversity projects.
Yeah, you're one of the smaller kind of startup brands that we mentioned at the very start of the conversation that shows that it can be done, that it is possible. So thank you for summarising that so brilliantly. Emily, would you be able to introduce yourself and what you do?
Yes, of course. I'm Emily Chan, and I'm Sustainability Editor at Vogue Global Network. So I work across all the Vogue websites, pretty much all of them, around the world, and covering sustainability in fashion, and also the climate crisis more generally as well. So yeah, trying to inspire the positive change that we're talking about today.
Amazing.
Yeah, I already mentioned you in our conversation being like, we have one such expert joining us. Both of you, I feel that this evening's discussion, it really, our end point here now is the consumer, and Rachel has prefaced this brilliantly, the onus can't lie wholly on the consumer. But if we've kind of established that making the consumer feel guilty does not work and does not inspire positive change, what for each of you does work?
I agree. I think that making consumers feel guilty and trying to focus too much on individual choices does tend to make people disengage. I think that what I try to do is kind of make it so that they feel like they're part of a wider movement, and kind of contributing positively towards systemic change that you were talking about in your discussion. And kind of, I guess the Pay Up campaign is a really good example of that, in that, you know, it's a way of, you know, how people kind of held brands account when they cancelled orders at the start of the COVID pandemic. And yeah, brands did well, not all brands, but a lot of brands did end up honouring some of those orders. So I think, yeah, kind of making sure that they feel empowered, I guess, as well, that they're contributing to a wider movement, I think, and not as you say, kind of feeling guilty about every single purchase that they're making, because yeah, I think that does tend to switch people off.
So involving them in that dialogue. Yeah. Edzard, how about you?
Well, I think so definitely agree with what Emily said about this feeling of kind of, I suppose, belonging towards a more collective good. But I think it's also potentially about kind of introducing one, from our point of view, it's also about you can kind of introduce one behavior change piece to your mode of purchasing. And I think that for us was also actually really the starting point with sheeping, because we wanted people to start thinking about where things came from and start to interrogate and start asking questions. You know, and because fashion industry has been such an opaque industry for so long, we simply as customers aren't conditioned to ask any questions. We go in, we try something on, we like it, we whip out our credit card and we walk out. And it's actually interesting, rather than it turning into this kind of like, you can actually kind of introduce one small kind of behavior change piece, which is just ask a question before you get your credit card out. Try it on, like it, and then you can ask, where's this come from? What impact does it have had? And should you not get the answer to that question, then you have to, at that point as a consumer, make a decision about whether you buy it or not. And I think just introducing, I suppose, that one simple mechanic into your way of buying could change so much, you know. And it would also, therefore, if brand can't give you the answer to that question, it would force brands to start changing their ways pretty quickly and having to become more transparent, having to also educate people who work for them to understand every single aspect of the brand so that they also have an answer to those questions. So for us, that's what it really, I think that's kind of one simple behavior change piece, but it is something that you can just bring into your mode of buying, right? It's just like ask the question, and should you not get the answer, not buy the garment. And yeah, that from our side, we think that's a really important behavior change piece that has to happen.
And actually, it's in the essence of it lies in that simplicity. And so much of sustainability, because it's a complex topic, is shrouded too often, like I mentioned, in stats and percentages and things that just confuse the consumer, whereas actually just ask a question, that makes it so much simpler. Rachel, I know that you'll probably want to weigh in. Do you have anything that you have to add here?
I just thought it was really interesting, Edzard, what you said there about having to think about the way that filters down through your employees as well. And I think that's one stakeholder we don't talk about very often within this sort of sustainable storytelling, messaging, understanding, education piece is actually, you know, the internal stakeholder too. I think so often things get really siloed within sustainability teams. And increasingly, of course, we're seeing that filter sort of more broadly, and we are seeing, of course, more buy-in from senior management, at least, or at least the sort of facade of that being the case, and hopefully it is, in many instances. But that view of sort of how it goes across other divisions as well, I think is a really interesting one, and particularly actually when we're talking about marketing and where that education piece lies there, with the marketer and the communicator actually having a full understanding of what's going on. For both of you, I mean, I'd love to hear your experience of that. And I mean, presumably it is obviously expanding and growing, but we still have a long way to go. I don't know.
Well, just to pick up on one thing you said there about the team kind of, I suppose having such kind of vital part to play, right, in the sustainability. I think that's the big thing that we've hopefully fostered also within Sheep Inc., within the team, is this ability for everybody to challenge us. And when I say us, I mean collectively to say, okay, what are you doing here? You know, people also who are, you know, kind of also the younger members of the team who kind of come in and also have, in some ways, have slightly more kind of, don't know the right word for it, but they interrogate these things more, right? They come in and go, why does it have to be done like this? How can we actually, why can't we change, for instance, this piece around our packaging? And they really come in and interrogate a lot of the stuff that we do. And I think that has been crucial for us also as we grow our business, to constantly have that sense of interrogation coming from every aspect of the business, coming from externally, which of course the second you are a sustainable brand, you do come under a lot more people question you, you know, that thing of being greenwashing, you know, kind of being a brand that is greenwashing is quickly kind of levied against you. But that coming from external keeps you on your toes and makes sure you have a good answer for all those questions and that you're constantly challenging yourselves, but also coming from internal to make sure that every member of your team is also challenging what you're doing.
I love that word, interrogation. That's a really good one for this.
Yeah, Emily, I'd actually love to pass that interrogation piece over to you and say, as sustainability editor, how much of your role is questioning the information that is sent to you by PRs?
Of course, yeah, it's a massive part. And I think to Rachel's question as well, that often the information just simply isn't out there, isn't available. And often I'll get a press release and I'll send a load of questions back, and, you know, it'll take maybe days for response, and it's not necessarily information that I was really asking for.
Yeah.
So I think there is a big gap in terms of information that brands are willing to kind of share. And it kind of touches upon Edzard's point as well about kind of consumers needing to have more information to make better decisions. And I think there is still a big information gap, and we do want to see more transparency from brands, because that will also help consumers make more positive choices as well. So yeah, it's a huge part of my job, I think. And yeah, I don't think we're quite there yet. I think there needs to be a lot more transparency.
Emily, I know we talked about this before, and I'd love you to share your view on what, you know, when we talk about this, so often we're talking from a very Europe-centric point of view on everything that's going on. And I'd love your view, and we do that particularly when we're talking about consumption. You know, we talk about sort of the sort of global south as being producing nations and kind of forget that in many instances they are huge consuming nations as well. So through the Vogue lens, what's your view on how this conversation is evolving in other countries around the world?
I think there's definitely interest in sustainability more widely, but I guess in some of the countries we work in, the conversation's still kind of more about the kind of basics, and it's about, you know, what you can do to kind of be a bit more eco-friendly. So I guess maybe it's not, you know, the kind of nuances of the conversation aren't necessarily as engaging for readers yet. But I think that it's not necessarily also just a global question. I think Rachel, Rosanna, one of you mentioned kind of being in a bit of a bubble in London as well. I think that it's actually there is still actually quite a specific audience that are really kind of engaging in sustainability on a regular basis, and I think we still need to broaden that audience, you know, more generally, even in the UK and Europe and US as well. So yeah, it's I think it's definitely, the positive thing is it's definitely a growing trend, like globally, and you know, Vogue are publishing more and more pieces on sustainability and kind of making it a really core part of the work we're doing, like, and that's across the board as well. So I think it's positive developments, but I think there is, yeah, a bit of a way to go.
We have one question that's come in for Edzard, is from Willie Gallia. Interested in knowing how Sheep Inc. measured and subsequently compensated the carbon emissions.
So first of all, we basically did a full LCA of our supply chain. So we worked with a group called this independent audit, and then you can figure out where your impact sits in various parts of the supply chain. So that gives the gross carbon footprint, and then we ran a separate process because we basically have these farms that are using regenerative farming methods. We had to figure out a way of measuring that net CO2 impact at farm level. So that was a big research piece that we did. So then out of that, you get a total kind of footprint. And then, you know, on that sense, we don't necessarily need to mitigate anything because we, of course, have a naturally carbon negative supply chain. But when we actually had when we were looking at it more from a gross carbon footprint point of view, when we launched, we hadn't done the full research to get to the right net carbon CO2 impact at farm level. We looked at it in a gross carbon footprint, and then what we did is we worked together with a group called Natural Capital Partners to figure out the best way of kind of deploying funds, basically. And that was, you know, and what we did in the beginning is we also said we want to have a 10 times the impact of our gross carbon footprint. So when we launched, that was around 30 kilograms of gross CO2 footprint, not taking any sequestration at the farm level into account. And then we said we want to mitigate at that point at least 300 kilograms worth of CO2.
Right.
And again, that's by working with a kind of a good investment body to kind of figure out the good projects to invest in.
Yeah, let's go back to those words I was saying, Rosanna, positive and natural and regenerative and abundance. And thank you, Edzard, like so insightful and exactly what we want to be seeing, you know, being able to really tell a story of how we're, giving back and regenerating everything that's happening rather than just taking, ultimately.
Yeah. And on that positive note and a rather circular way round to it all, thank you both for joining our very first ever Instagram live room. So enjoyed having you, and I feel that you both brought different perspectives. And I just wanted to say a final thank you to our sponsor Klaviyo and to everyone who joined. Lots of you on the live this evening. So obviously digital fatigue and live fatigue has not yet set in. I'm pleased you're all here. Thank you very much for joining. It's a super important.
Thank you so much for having us.
Great. Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thank you both. Take care, everyone.
Take care.
Take care, guys.
Bye.
Bye.